We're living in a time when free speech is increasingly under threat in the country, as evidenced by some of our cases of street preachers being arrested and people losing their jobs just for expressing what they think. And I'm delighted to have Toby Young here, the founder and director of the Free Speech Union, to discuss this.
I guess what's shocking is how quickly it happened. If you try and dissuade your child from taking puberty blockers, should that become a criminal offence? It seems absolutely insane. Now, to express Orthodox Christian beliefs is effectively a form of blasphemy.
I think you had your third birthday, was it just recently, Toby?
Yep.
And congratulations on that. Just explain briefly why you set up the Free Speech Union and what you're doing now.
So I set up the Free Speech Union in 2020.
Just before the lockdown, I suppose.
It's just before the lockdown. And, because I thought that free speech had never been in greater peril across the West, since 1945. And I thought that, things had reached rock bottom and could only get better from that point onwards. But then shortly after setting it up, we had the lockdown and lots of people, challenging the government's pandemic response, found themselves targeted by outrage mobs, accused of putting profit before people, being granny killers. So suddenly that produced a big escalation in the number of people being cancelled, getting into difficulty for exercising their lawful right to free speech. And then shortly after we locked down, we had the Black Lives Matter imbroglio. And again, anyone challenging a lot of the views associated with that movement, challenging the idea that Britain's systemically racist, for instance, suddenly found themselves targeted by outrage mobs. So actually things got significantly worse from a free speech point of view within months of setting up the Free Speech Union, which in some ways was good for the organisation because it was clear, we had a lot to do and it encouraged people to join. And we've now got around 11,000 members, 16 employees, 8 of them full-time. I checked yesterday, we've got currently 32 open legal cases at various different stages. We've got 2 full-time lawyers on staff. We're about to hire a 3rd full-time lawyer. We've got 2 full-time case officers. So we're really busy. We've got over 100 open cases at the moment. Not all of them go to law. We've never been busier. There's never been more demand for our services. Anyone watching this is concerned that they might be targeted by an outrage mob. They might be placed under investigation by their employer or get into trouble at their university for exercising their lawful right to free speech but saying something contentious or unfashionable, then do join.
Great. Well, it's great work that you're doing, Toby. And one of the things you have done is supported some of our legal cases of Christians. Most recently, you kindly wrote an expert report for the charge and, in fact, conviction of street preacher Dave McConnell, who was actually, arrested, charged, prosecuted and convicted for misgendering a chap. Tell us why you supported that case and why you think that's important.
Yeah, that was, I think, a really important case. So people watching this probably know the detail, but Dave McConnell, evangelical Christian street preacher, was heckled by a trans woman in Leeds city centre when he was preaching.
You invited her to ask a question, or him to ask a question, didn't he?
Yeah. And he repeatedly misgendered this trans woman, i.e. referred to the fact that she was a biological male.
So this gentleman,
referred to them, her, him as this gentleman. And the crowd got kind of riled up on the trans woman's behalf. And a policeman appeared on the scene, and at the instigation of the crowd, the policeman arrested David McConnell, and he was charged with a public order offence of intentionally causing harassment, alarm or distress to this trans woman, and incredibly convicted, I think, in Leeds Magistrates Court. And the Christian Legal Centre helped him appeal that conviction. And you asked me to appear as an expert witness for the defence, and I submitted an expert witness statement. In the end, I wasn't called because the judge granted the appeal before it was necessary to hear my evidence or to get into an argument about whether my evidence was admissible or not. But it was a great victory because had the conviction not been overturned, then it would have effectively established a precedent that misgendering a trans woman is in fact a public order offence, is a criminal offence.
Yes.
And I think he was sentenced to 80 hours community service.
Yes,
I mean,
and a fine as well.
Quite a serious penalty.
Yeah.
And that would have been a grotesque interference in freedom of speech. I mean, I'm a defender of trans rights, but I wouldn't defend the
compelled speech.
Yeah,
it's
compelling
it,
people to use a trans person's preferred gender pronouns. I mean, I do it out of courtesy, but I don't think I should do it on pain of being prosecuted if I don't. That just seems completely absurd and totally incompatible with Article 10 and Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
This trans woman didn't have to engage with the preacher, but did engage deliberately on their own behalf, and the preacher was in conscience saying, "This is a man, and surely he should be able to speak according to his conscience."
Yes, I mean it was an interesting case because it was a perfect illustration of how blasphemy laws have now been repealed.
Right.
Blasphemy laws, which essentially said that if you blaspheme against Christianity, you could be prosecuted. Blasphemy laws have now been repealed,
Correct.
but we now have unofficial blasphemy laws, which almost became official in this case, which is that if you effectively blaspheme against gender identity ideology by refusing to use their preferred gender pronoun, then you can be prosecuted. So it's a perfect illustration.
It's almost like we've deified ourselves, because I define who I am, that makes me my God, and then if you blaspheme against my God, which is my identity, do you see what I mean? That's how it becomes a blasphemy, because it's kind of like we made ourselves into our own God because we define our own identities.
I guess what's slightly shocking is how quickly it happened. We repealed blasphemy laws quite recently, very recently in the case of Ireland. And yet now, to express Orthodox Christian beliefs in the public square is effectively a form of blasphemy. I mean, that happened so quickly. There was a tiny period in which we didn't have blasphemy laws, and now we have, and they're almost exactly the opposite of what they were less than 10 years ago.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? So that's a rapid shift in culture. And of course, you've also supported us in other street preach cases, and most notably I remember Hatton Tash, which is another kind of blasphemy kind of thing that's going on there with relation to Islam, right? Because she was wearing a cartoon of Muhammad, and she was holding up a Quran that she drilled holes in to make a point about that. And you remember she was arrested and held overnight and strip searched and all of this. And I think you wrote a letter to the Met Police about this.
Yeah, I think we've intervened a couple of times on Hatton's behalf. The most recent case was the most egregious, in which she was arrested at Speaker's Corner the day before, I think, the 150th anniversary of Speaker's Corner. Right. And she was arrested, I think, under suspicion of having committed a public order offence, taken to Charing Cross Police Station. She was strip searched and then held in the cells for, I think, something like 24 hours and interrogated. With her
glasses removed so she couldn't read as well, yeah.
It was extraordinary. And again, as you say, it's an example of an unofficial blasphemy law operating. What was her sin? It was to offend, fanatical young Muslim men at Speaker's Corner by holding a copy of the Quran, which had been deliberately damaged, or I think she'd put holes in it to illustrate her belief that Islam is full of holes.
Holes in the narrative, yes.
Holes in the narrative, and she was wearing, I think, a T-shirt with one of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. So fairly provocative, but not unlawful, at least, seemingly not unlawful.
It's her own copy of the book.
It's her own copy. She's, you can't be accused of criminally damaging your own property. We saw the same thing in Wakefield recently with the 4 boys who got into trouble because one of them brought a copy of the Quran that he himself had bought on Amazon.
His own copy,
into school,
a translation as well.
A translation, and they were reading passages out from it on the school tennis court, and then in the school someone knocked it out of his hand, fell to the ground, got slightly scuffed, one of the pages slightly torn. Suddenly there was a kind of burning forest fire of outrage in the local Islamic community, and the police were called in. The school interviewed 30 boys. It ended up suspending these 4 boys. There was what felt like a kind of Sharia law show trial at the local mosque.
With the police there?
And the police were there, nodding along as the imam said, that it was completely unacceptable to treat the Quran in this way. It was a breach of their sacred values. And instead of the police saying, well, it's not our job to enforce Islamic blasphemy laws in the UK, they instead reassured the congregation that they had recorded this episode as a non-crime hate incident, which was absolutely extraordinary. It's not a hate incident to damage your own copy of the Quran. And, even the school said there was no malicious intent, and the boys were only 14.
Why? This is the point I really don't understand. Why, if the school says there's no malicious intent, why is anybody punished?
Well, because NCHIs are perception-based. So it's a non-crime hate incident if anyone perceives the accused of being motivated by hostility towards the victim on the basis of the victim's possession of a protected characteristic. And religion is a protected characteristic, so if the damage to the Quran was perceived by some, albeit mistakenly, as an act of hostility towards people of the Islamic faith, then it can be legitimately, as things stand, recorded as a non-crime hate incident, which shows you what's wrong with.
Still doesn't justify the suspension of the boys either, and doesn't
certainly
mean
not.
that this is a good
No,
way of organising it.
And the Suella Braverman has recently laid before Parliament a new statutory code of practice about the recording and retention of non-crime hate incidents, and one of the clauses in that new code of practice is that they cannot be recorded against school children. So things will improve, I think, assuming that code of practice gets the stamp of approval from both houses of Parliament.
It's absurd to get for a child to get an incident recorded by the police for dropping their own property. I mean, that is the most absurd thing. Are you concerned about the sort of Islamic aspect though of this? There's a kind of blasphemy in terms of identity, but what the Islamic thing as well is kind of seems to be increasing, doesn't it, in that sense?
Well, the really concerning thing, I think, about this episode in Wakefield is that I hoped that Muslim communities in places like Wakefield would become more assimilated and wouldn't imagine that it's the role of the state to enforce their particular blasphemy codes, any more than it is now the role of the state to enforce Christian blasphemy codes. Or the school. Yeah. But the problem is that so many people in authority, including the police, have taken it upon themselves to do the bidding of, Islamic fundamentalists, and indeed enforce their blasphemy codes, even if it's only recording non-crime hate incidents against people who say things that Muslims find offensive. But I guess the really depressing thing, listening to that imam, is that he seemed to think he was perfectly entitled to expect the state to enforce observance by non-Muslims of Muslim blasphemy codes. And we can see the same thing with, LGBTQ plus activists expecting the state to enforce their blasphemy codes. Yeah. I mean, either we have, protections for all groups in our society and severe limits on what people can say, and being offensive becomes an offence, or we don't. But you can't say for just these...
Well, it kind of has to be equality before the law, doesn't it?
There has to be equality before the law.
Yeah. So, and another case, just think about this, which does relate again to the blasphemy sort of point, isn't it, is one of our street preachers, John Dunn. Did you see this, where the Crown Prosecution Service actually made a legal argument that references in the Bible are no longer, quote, simply no longer appropriate and would be deemed offensive if stated in public. Fortunately, a question was asked in Parliament about this, and the government forced the Crown Prosecution Service to back down from this. But this is exactly to your point, isn't it? Like, not many years ago, we had a Christian blasphemy law, and now the Crown Prosecution Service argues that quoting the Bible in public could be a criminal offence.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. And I don't think the Church of England has done much to help itself in this area. So one of the people we looked after was a a prelate in the Church of England, hoping to become a fully fledged vicar. And when his wife gave birth to their child, he posted this exuberant, joyful, celebratory message on Twitter about how much joy having a child had brought to him, urged other people to have as many children as they could, married couples, and quoted the psalm about going forth and multiplying. And there was an immediate pile on Twitter. Lots of women calling him out for his insensitivity. What about couples who can't have children? How are they supposed to feel when they read this tweet? Don't you know that having too many children is bad for the environment? You really shouldn't be encouraging people to have more than one, given what their carbon footprint is likely to be. And extraordinary. It turned out when he drilled down into who was piling on that they were mainly Church of England female vicars.
Really?
Absolutely. And one of them, perhaps more than one of them, complained to his archdeacon. And instead of dismissing this complaint, he's training to be a vicar, quoting a psalm isn't yet a disqualifying... instead of saying that, he took the complaint seriously and put this poor man under investigation. And that's when he reached out to the Free Speech Union. And we managed to negotiate the penalty down to a course of psychotherapy. So within the Church of England, if you express Orthodox Christian beliefs, if you quote the Psalms, they now think you're a bit mad.
Well,
which is pretty extraordinary.
It is, the Church of England is actually part of the problem now, and as you're probably familiar with the case of Reverend Dr. Bernard Randall, who was literally preaching Church of England doctrine in a Church of England school where he worked, in a Church of England act of worship, in a Church of England chapel, and lost his job for that. And then the Church of England themselves regarded him as have actually branded him as safeguarding risk for teaching Church of England doctrine that marriage is between a man and a woman.
Yeah. That is an extraordinary case too. And the Free Speech Union actually complained to the Charity Commission about the school. It's an independent school, it's a charity, asking them to investigate why they were interfering in the free speech of one of their employees in this way. Unfortunately, they refused to open an investigation into the charity. But I know that the Christian Legal Centre has taken this further. I think in the Employment Tribunal, he lost.
Yeah, he's lost just a few weeks back. We think it's extraordinary judgment because if the judgment stands, as I read it, if you preach that marriage between a man and woman, you could lose your job. That's justification for losing your job.
Yes.
Yeah. That's an extraordinary thing that cannot stand, and I think it's a really bad judgment. And obviously we are going to appeal it. Yeah. But it all takes time, and in the meantime he's out of a job. And the Church of England have branded him as safeguarding risk, so he's not allowed to preach or teach in any Church of England church.
It's a shocking case, and I guess it illustrates the way in which the Church of England has completely embraced the LGBTQITI plus agenda. I might have got the initials wrong there. It's sort of puzzling as to why they've kind of embraced it, hook, line and sinker. I think the explanation must be that they think that it's a way of making the church more relevant, helping woke activists understand why they should come to church and why the church is their ally and not their enemy. They think it'll, fill up the pews, but it's completely misguided.
Well, it's false because we did a little analysis that showed all the biggest churches or the biggest youth groups have Orthodox teaching. So the way to attract people actually is to use Orthodox teaching of Christianity, not to go down the whole woke thing, which everyone can see is just mimicking the culture.
Yeah, the puzzling thing about this is that when people kind of, when social psychologists try and understand the great awakening, often one part of that explanation is, people have filled the God-shaped hole left by the kind of ebbing away of the Christian tide. It gives their life meaning and purpose in a way that being a member of a church would have done 50 years ago. Yes. But in the case of the Church of England, how do you explain it then? Why have they embraced the woke agenda? Have they got a God-shaped hole where kind of Orthodox Christian beliefs once were? It's slightly puzzling, isn't it?
Another case, though, that I think you were quite early support as well is the case of Kristie Higgs, who was working as a school pastoral assistant, and posted on Facebook concerns, widely shared concerns about sex education in schools. Concerns that have now actually prompted Rishi Sunak to formally say this is going to be reviewed. And yet she lost her job for that private, in her own capacity, Facebook post. Just tell us your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, well, I think that was a twofold injustice. First of all, as you say, she shouldn't have been punished for raising the alarm about the use of what were plainly inappropriate teaching materials in her primary school to teach children about sex. But secondly, she raised the alarm on her private Facebook account, not in the school, not in her capacity as a teaching assistant. So she shouldn't have been punished on either basis. I think she's got two really good grounds for defence, and I hope the Employment Tribunal sees it that way.
So another topic, though, Toby, which I know that the Free Speech Union has also been good campaigning on, is conversion therapy. And this whole thing which the government is planning to ban, so-called conversion therapy, which, given the government has said itself that anything physical done in the name of Christian therapy is already illegal, they are talking about banning certain types of consensual conversations. Tell us what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I do think the proposed ban on conversion therapy, I mean, at the moment, no bill has been laid before either the Scottish Parliament or the Westminster Parliament, but it seems as though it's heading towards us. The Free Speech Union's concerns about it are, I think, twofold. First of all, we don't think that religious leaders, whether Christian or Muslim, should be prosecuted for consensually engaging with members of their congregation who are concerned about homosexual feelings and, praying with them or whatever it is they might do. If it's completely consensual, if there's no element of coercion, then the state has no business trying to, criminalise it. And secondly, there's the issue of, well, how do you define conversion therapy? And the concern is that within these bills, that refusing to affirm the self-diagnosis of a child presenting with gender dysphoria will be tantamount to conversion therapy and prosecutable. And I think this is a legitimate concern, not a straw man. So the committee of the Scottish Parliament, when it made its recommendation that, yes, a conversion therapy ban should be introduced in Scotland, recommended the conversion therapy ban in the state of Victoria in Australia as a model. And in the state of Australia, in the state of Victoria, in Australia, it is actually an offence now for a parent to try and prevent a child of theirs being prescribed puberty blockers, which is extraordinary. Is that going to be an offence in Scotland? If your child is referred to a clinician by their school without your consent as a parent, and the clinician sets them on a medical pathway beginning with taking puberty blockers, if you try and dissuade your child from taking puberty blockers, should that become a criminal offence? It seems absolutely insane. But that seems to be the direction in which we're heading, certainly in Scotland and possibly here too.
Are you pessimistic about this then? What do you think about it? My view is that more people seem to be waking up to the issues with this. Do you agree with that? Well,
I think one source of hope is that there is a coalition, not only involving not just different religious groups, because I think Muslims are as concerned about this as Christians, but also gender-critical feminists, and that's a powerful coalition.
And free speech people as well,
and of course people concerned about free speech.
Yeah.
So I think provided we can campaign effectively against it, I think we have a chance of stopping it, or at least making any conversion therapy ban in Westminster anyway, in the Westminster Parliament, less egregious than it appears to be. And there is a long. I mean, I think there's currently a long period of pre-legislative scrutiny regarding a conversion therapy ban, and that's a big opportunity for all of us who are concerned about it to tell our MPs that we're really concerned about this. We have a pro forma letter that we put up from time to time on the Free Speech Union website, which people can use to express their concerns about it to their MPs.
Yeah, very good. So I gather you've mentioned you're seeing a lot of cases and a lot of inquiries. We get about 1,000 case inquiries a year, and we're running about some dozens of cases as well. How do you see this playing out? Do you think it's just going to get worse and worse, or are we going to see some recovery of free speech in the country?
I'm slightly nervous about claiming that, we've reached rock bottom and things will improve from now on, because that's what I thought 3 years ago.
Yes.
So just when you think things are getting better, a new dragon kind of emerges on the horizon. I mean, I think one big dragon at the moment is the metastasizing disinfo lobby, referred to, I think, in Congress recently by Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, who were instrumental in tweeting about the Twitter files. They were given access to the Twitter files by Elon Musk. They were tweeting about it. They testified before Congress, and they referred to the kind of disinfo industry as the censorship industrial complex. And this is, state agencies, NGOs, private companies combining to try and suppress dissent from, for the most part, fashionable woke orthodoxies, not by saying we disagree with these points of view, but by expressing these points of view as a form of disinformation or malinformation. And that's proved to be an extremely powerful sleight of hand, responsible for vast swathes of censorship, not just on Twitter, but on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, and not just in America, but here too. And we discovered, thanks to the work of Big Brother Watch, that various state agencies, including a brigade of the British Army, were involved during the pandemic in identifying people criticising the government's pandemic response on social media, alerting the departments they were kind of within, the Whitehall departments they were on secondment to, about these tweets, and then the departments would use their trusted, or these social media posts, the departments would then use their...
Some of them were your tweets, were they not? I think
so I was one of the people whose tweets were flagged by some of these shadowy agencies. Yeah, but it's a really pernicious, insidious form of censorship. And I guess it has parallels with the way in which people try and shut down expressions of Orthodox Christian belief. The manner in which people shut that down is not to directly engage with the people expressing those beliefs and say, you hold different values to me, and I disagree with what you've just said for the following reasons. That would be perfectly reasonable. Then you have a kind of grown-up discussion about whether those are the values we should embrace or not. No, instead they say, what you've just said is hate speech, and therefore is out of bounds and doesn't deserve being discussed. It's a way of it's a sort of way of sidestepping having a difficult conversation or having to make an argument. In the same way as, opponents of Orthodox Christians will describe expressions of their beliefs as hate speech, so people have been describing expressions of dissent about the mRNA vaccines or the war in Ukraine or about net zero, not as a difference of opinion, but as misinformation or disinformation or malinformation.
And that's obviously a problem for rational debate in society, which is the bedrock of a functioning democracy. You've got to be able to have functioning debates and express disagreements and
absolutely. I mean, it's one of the sort of most alarming developments, I think, of the past 15 years, maybe 25 years, has been that the doctrine used to be, if somebody said something you profoundly disagreed with or you thought was mistaken, the response was not to try and censor them, but to confront what they had said with better speech.
Explain why they're wrong.
That was the doctrine established by the US Supreme Court, known as the counter-speech doctrine, and was the kind of position of the global liberal elite for decades. But that's now been abandoned, and now they've moved to thinking, in America, here, across the Anglosphere, even in parts of Europe, the position now is if you've said something we profoundly disagree with or which we think is false or misleading, then we're perfectly entitled to stop you saying it in various ways, which is a disastrous volte-face.
And do you think, because our perspective here at Christian is that, part of the reason that we're losing a sort of moral framework that we had, an agreed moral framework based on Christianity, just a few decades ago, arguably, certainly generations ago, and now we've moved away from that. Then we're seeing some of the chaos and there's a lack of agreed moral framework and all of these kind of things emerging. Would you agree with that, or what would your view on that be?
Yes, I think there's certainly something to that. Ed West, who's an excellent conservative journalist, thinker, intellectual, he recently wrote an essay on his Substack about why it was that all these unofficial blasphemy laws had sprung up since the repeal of official blasphemy laws. Right. And he said it's a characteristic of a multi-ethnic, multicultural society. If you don't require assimilation, but instead you require everybody in society respect the sacred values and beliefs of all these different groups, then you're going to have a proliferation of these unofficial blasphemy laws. That free speech, in some senses, depends upon a more homogenous society in which there's a bit more social solidarity and an agreed set of moral values, sacred beliefs. Once you have, once that homogeneity breaks down, once the consensus about where you should and shouldn't go when it comes to speech breaks down, then you, instead of having more speech, you have much less free speech, and you have many more groups petitioning the authorities to punish people for saying something that's offended them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Toby, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for all your work you're doing in free speech and defending your own cases and our cases as well. And all the best in doing it, and we'll fight together where we can to see free speech upheld across the country.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks for all the good work you do. And yeah, if anyone wants to join the Free Speech Union, it's www.freespeechunion.org.
Brilliant. Thank you.